out today. I'd like to talk a little bit about my organization and speak about what we do and why blasphemy is an issue that is very close to my heart. I was raised in Pakistan and grew up Sunni Muslim. I was practicing up until my late 20s when the sudden religiosity of a friend forced me to look deeper into my faith. Today I'm known as Muhammad the Atheist among my friends, a title I'm proud to wear. I co-founded the Ex-Muslims of North America in 2013 and have been serving as our first president. We began the organization in an effort to end the social isolation ex-Muslims face. We do this by establishing local events, which are limited to a very select group of people, each of whom have been personally vetted, have been spoken to one-on-one by our team of screeners, and have verified their identity. After they are screened, they can join our local gatherings and participate in our private groups. The arduous process to attend these events in our organization is not a luxury, but a necessity. I don't believe that our success, over 16 groups in just 2 years, would have happened without it. It is because ex-Muslims have trusted that we would take care of their privacy and anonymity that we have grown. Some are surprised that we go through so many steps to ensure the safety of our participants in the West, where it is assumed we have no real dangers to fear. It is true that there is no state persecution of unbelievers in the West, and in fact our freedom to believe as we wish is protected by the government, without which we would not have reached the success we have. However, the average ex-Muslim, even in the West, is highly likely to hide their apostasy completely from their family and friends. Some because they fear social isolation, others because they fear physical abuse from their friends and their closest family members. The risk of being open about your lack of faith is often too high. We help to alleviate both the risk of exposure by our security and anonymity measures, as well as the social cost of coming out, by providing an alternative support and social network. We hope that by building local communities of ex-Muslims in every major city with a significant Muslim population, we can combat the severe social isolation many ex-Muslims face and unite us in an effort to demand change from those that deny our very existence. What we're doing here today, celebrating the importance of and the right to blaspheme, is both an endeavor freethinkers have engaged in for hundreds, even thousands of years, and at the same time singular. At this moment, the atheist, freethinker, skeptic movement has a strength, a focus, a resolve that it has never had before. Some of this comes because those of us in the West are faced today with a challenge we have not seen since the Dark Ages. Too much of the freedoms that we enjoy here today are taken for granted. All too easily we forget our journey to get here. We forget the obstacles, the challenges, and that these rights that we assume as a birthright were never simply just handed over. They were fought for tooth and nail. Fought for by radicals, by those who believed in fighting for their ideals, by exemplifying them. Those who fought for our right to blaspheme by blaspheming themselves, and not accidentally. By blaspheming with purpose, with determination, out of a belief that it is a matter of individual liberty to contest every idea, no matter how sacred it may be to some. That only by granting every individual the freedom to explore and uphold their own opinion and belief do we as a society progress. Perverse as it may sound, the shock that we experienced on the evening of the Charlie Hebdo murder exemplified how far we have come. A little over a century ago, G.W. Foote was imprisoned in England for publishing blasphemous cartoons. Not too long before that, losing your life because of a perceived insult to a religion was commonplace. Now, a trial for blasphemy, at least in the West, is seen as a relic of an antiquated era, lumped together with times when we burned witches for heresy. But before we get too comfortable, we must remember that there are many parts of the world where what we view as a distant past is a dangerous and present-day reality. In 22% of countries in the world, blasphemy laws still enjoy the force of law. Many are used to persecute not just those that speak out, but those that are part of minority groups. In Pakistan, for example, Christian and other minorities are routinely harassed, and if they respond to the provocation, they are arrested or worse. The infamous case in Pakistan where a Christian mother of 5, Asya Bibi, was harassed and claimed that Jesus' divinity were denounced. When she responded in kind, she was in turn arrested and has been imprisoned on death row for the better part of a decade. Similarly, in 11% of countries in the world, disbelief is not tolerated and apostasy is punished by the state. You may notice a similarity in this map and that of where ex-Muslims originate. For many of us, simply speaking up makes it dangerous, if not outright impossible, to ever return to our parents' home or see loved ones again. We see countless examples of persecution that are championed by human rights organizations, but those are merely the tip of the iceberg, those that have been fortunate enough to reach the attention of international human rights organizations. Those that are in prison range from the well-publicized case of Raif Badawi in Saudi Arabia, who was imprisoned for calling for a separation of mosque and state and demanded secularism and liberalism. He has been imprisoned for a period of 10 years and sentenced to 1,000 lashes and a fine of 1 million riyals. Alexander An in Indonesia was in prison for professing disbelief. Others, on the other hand, have been outright murdered simply because they were accused of blasphemy. Even Yolande Poston was tried for on Section 140 and 266 of the Criminal Code. The first of which prohibits disturbing public order by publicly ridiculing or insulting the dogmas of worship of any lawfully existing religious community in Denmark. The second criminalizes insult, threat, or degradation of natural persons by publicly and with malice attacking their race, color of skin, national or ethnic root, sexual orientation, or faith. Happily, they were not charged with a criminal offense. But although the newspaper did not face a state censor, they were nevertheless exposed to an unprecedented amount of outrage, scrutiny, threats, and harassment by both the national and international community. To begin with, as a result of the expected threat of physical violence, many newspaper sellers refused to distribute the day's paper to the public. Further, to fan the flames, extremely inflammatory images that were never a part of the newspaper's print began to be circulated as evidence of their Islamophobia by Danish imams. These imams traveled around the world to rally support among Muslim countries. Outlandish claims were made to religious leaders in Muslim countries, such as mosques being prohibited or Islam not being recognized as a religion in Denmark. The fact that the Prime Minister Anders Fogh belonged to the same political party as Amherst and had honored her prior to being elected was also used as further evidence to buttress their sentiments. Conspiracy theories claim that he enjoyed direct control or perhaps ownership of Yolande Poston. Their efforts bore fruit in many Muslim countries with violent protests racking countries around the world, resulting in attacks on Danish and European missions and churches with over 200 deaths. As a result of the ensuing death threats and violence, the cartoonists themselves had to go into hiding. While solidarity was demonstrated within continental Europe, with widespread reprinting of the cartoons, Canada and the UK did not follow suit, nor did many in the United States. Jeremy Corbyn, the current leader of the Labour Party in the UK, the main opposition party, made the statement, "We demand that people show respect for each other's community, each other's faith, and each other's religion." Similarly, Jack Straw, the British Foreign Secretary, stated that there is freedom of speech, we respect that, but there is not any obligation to insult or to inflame. I believe that the republication of these cartoons has been unnecessary. It has been insensitive, disrespectful, and wrong. In his book, the editor of the Yolande Poston, Fleming Rose, describes it as an incredulity when attending an event on International Human Rights Day, in which he took part. On this day, participants gathered to celebrate and work towards extending human rights to all. Presumably, the human right to expression was a part of this. A panel was organized by Amnesty International and the Danish Institute of Human Rights. Given the violence towards the cartoonists and the disproportionate response, you may expect the panel to cover the importance of free speech as a human right. Instead, the panel was held under the title Victims of Free Speech, as some participants believed that, quote, the Muhammad cartoons had left in their wake a trail of victims, the victims of free speech. Since then, rather than holding fast to the principles of freedom of speech, it seems we instead withdraw further and further. Following the attacks in 2006, the magazine Charlie Hebdo, which had republished the cartoons in solidarity with violence posted, was condemned by the French president, Jacques Chirac, stating anything that can hurt the convictions of someone else, in particular religious convictions, should be avoided. Charlie Hebdo continued the tradition of blaspheming against all, including Islam. Its offices were attacked in 2011 and again this January, when 11 people were killed by French-Algerian Islamists. Initially, the magazine enjoyed broad support. There were public condemnations of the killers, both within France and with international leaders and media. Soon, the showing of solidarity turned into an echo of Chirac's statement, and the conversation shifted in which even those who could not speak a lick of French, even those who did not understand the political context in which the cartoons were published, began passing judgment on the magazine and their writers. Questions about whether the type of speech so offensive and troubling to a minority, should be acceptable in our society began to crop up before the bodies were cold. The feelings of Muslims, it seemed, were to be given preference to one of the foundational principles of our secular society. But of course, the traditions of Charlie Hebdo were concordant with the traditions of the past centuries, of those that had championed the rights of free speech against those that would outlaw blasphemy. Those who called themselves freethinkers were some of the most radical of this bunch. The Freethinker was a secular humanist publication launched in 1881 expressly to push the boundaries of speech and fight against religious dominance. In the words of its founder, the Freethinker is an anti-Christian organ and must therefore be chiefly aggressive. It will wage relentless war against superstition in general and against Christian superstition in particular. It will do its best to employ the resources of science, scholarship, philosophy, and ethics against the claims of the Bible as a divine revelation. It will not scruple to employ for the same purpose any weapon of ridicule, sarcasm that may be borrowed from the armory of common sense. In the magazine's Christmas 1882 edition, they published cartoons mocking the Christian faith and were tried and imprisoned for blasphemy. There was public outrage at the excessive sentence and was reported in the Bury and Northwich Post that is confidently expected that the result of the trial will be that the law which makes an indictment for blasphemy possible will be radically altered before any long space of time has passed. In contrast, in the East, the concept of persecution for ideas or opinions, especially those considered to be blasphemy, is widely accepted. Indeed, the tradition of religious sanctity, being inviolable, has never been seriously challenged. From the early days of the Islamic caliphates, trials of those believed to be diverging from the path of Islam were present. Abu Bakr, the first caliph, engaged in wars against those that had left Islam, many of which ended with the dissenting group's destruction or forced reconversion to Islam. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, one of the most respected Sunni authorities and chairman of the International Union of Muslim Scholars, believed that to have been for the immense benefit of religion, and stated, if they had gotten rid of the punishment for apostasy, Islam would not exist today. One of the Abbasid caliphs, Abu Abbas, stated that tolerance is laudable, except in matters dangerous to religious belief. Later caliphs would continue to establish inquisitions which would include hunting down and execution of those accused of heresy. In the early modern era, both the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire in India continued the process of imprisoning and executing those accused of blasphemy. Even India under the British struggled with the problem of persecution of unbelievers. The Indian Law Commission in 1837 observed, a person who should offer a gross insult to the Mohammedan religion in the presence of a zealous professor of that religion would probably move those whom he insulted to more violent anger than if he had caused them severe bodily injury. Tensions reached new heights in 1923 when a Muslim publication compared a Hindu goddess to a prostitute. In response, a pamphlet titled The Colorful Prophet was published, which included details of Muhammad's sexual appetites as recorded in the Islamic scriptures. Following the ensuing controversy and the murder of the author by a young Muslim, the British government enacted the Blasphemy Law 295A, which codified the illegality of insult of religion. This law is the ancestor of modern-day blasphemy laws in India and Pakistan. In spite of this, riots at perceived religious insults continued with frequent regularity over the ensuing decades. This continues on even now. Starting in 1999, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, an organization that includes 57 majority Muslim countries, began introducing a resolution to the UN Human Rights Commission, which is currently chaired by Saudi Arabia, against the defamation of religion, hoping to internationalize blasphemy laws. Representatives of Muslim states like Pakistan stated that defamation of religion could and had led to violence. The end result was the creation of a kind of Islamophobia in which Muslims were typecast as terrorists. Most of the developing world supported the resolution, including Russia and China. In 2011, with US support, a version of the resolution was approved by the General Assembly. The resolution calls on states to adopt measures to criminalize incitement to eminent violence based on religion. Unlike in the United States, where eminent violence is defined very narrowly, the Secretary General of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has stated that he believes the purpose of the resolution is to respect religious feelings, not specifically to prevent violence. While we hold out in the vain hope that acceding to the demands of those that aim to expand the reach of blasphemy laws will allow us to push reform by maintaining good relations, human rights activists from Muslim countries themselves, such as Asma Jahangir, oppose the measure, stating its potential harm may be greater than what it prevents. Accusations of defamation of religions might stifle legitimate criticism or even research on practices and laws appearing to be in violation of human rights, but that are, or at least are perceived to be sanctioned by religion. According to Jonathan Turley of George Washington University, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has hit on a winning strategy to get Western countries to break away from their commitment to free speech by repackaging blasphemy as hate speech and free speech as a manifestation of intolerance. Similarly, with mainstream civil society, religious groups have been attempting to subvert this norm by blurring the line between racial prejudice and xenophobia in religious criticism. Increasingly, a religious group is being treated as a racial one with dire consequences for freedom of speech and human rights. Organizations such as Council on American Islamic Relations have been pushing the idea that an attack on Islam is indistinguishable from a hate-based attack on Muslims. The terms anti-Islam and anti-Muslim, which refer to two completely different forms of intolerance, are merged as one, creating an atmosphere where blasphemy against the religion is equivalent to a racial attack against the believers. It has been pointed out by various commentators about how conflating the two concepts is harmful. Yet there is an increasing use of terms like Islamophobia which make no useful distinction. Since critiques of Islamic texts and practices is an indispensable aspect of protesting human rights abuses in the name of religion, this puts human rights campaigners in a terrible predicament. We cannot talk about what we believe to be the ultimate source of a variety of problems plaguing our community. That includes domestic violence, child abuse, including child marriage, modesty codes, vilification of both male and female sexuality, forced segregation, intolerance of pluralism and dissent. There are many of us who believe that even if religion is not the root of all these evils, it plays a part, and one that we cannot afford to ignore. As we know from our experiences here in the West with gay rights, religion affects social attitudes. Much of the data correlates with similar conclusions. High support for Sharia within South Asia and the Middle East regions correlates with high support for women being denied equality in inheritance laws, widespread support for women's inferior status as someone who must obey her husband. We must remember many of the most radical thinkers and reformists in past eras were blasphemers against the established order of their day. Even a religious figure such as Muhammad himself caused offense when he blasphemed against the pagan gods of Arabia. The issue, however, is far more wide-ranging than individual values. The continued future of any culture or civilization is dependent upon the free expression of ideas. Without these heresies, progress itself is impossible. Ideas that were once heretical are now the bedrock of our understanding of the universe. if Galileo's ideas had been suppressed, if Charles Darwin had not the space or ability to express his views, how much poorer would all of humanity be today? Consider the lost and unexpressed genius that humanity is deprived of, and the lost economic opportunities for those often impoverished countries in which these blasphemy laws prevail. In his excellent treatise, Muslim in Science, Pervez Hoodbhoy, a Pakistani nuclear physicist, cites statistics on how the state of Israel, with a population of a mere 6 million, outproduces the collective 1.5 billion population of Muslim countries in terms of research output. A more immediate example, perhaps, is the International Scientific Conference organized by the government of Pakistan, in which the potential utilization of genies, yes, genies, as an alternative energy source was presented as a promising avenue for research and development. In Islamic mythology, genies are beings of fire. They are mentioned within the Quran itself. If a self-respecting scientist were to criticize the conference, would it be, technically speaking, blasphemy or apostasy? It is a simple thing to condemn the blasphemy laws that so clearly and visibly harm religious minorities, reformists and unbelievers on an individual level, and on the arts and sciences on a societal level. But we must do more. We must combat the underlying assumptions that ground blasphemy laws, the philosophical foundations that convince its proponents that what they do is morally justified, the twisted idea that freedom of speech does not extend to freedom to offend. We must remember that the idea that speech is a protected right, that in any individual is himself the arbiter of what information to receive and impart, and there is a right to hold and express opinions, is a very new concept. Even now, even in the West, not everyone is convinced. There are those both on the left and the right who believe that there is such a thing as good speech and bad speech, and that it is the duty of the state to find the balance between the two and place restrictions as necessary. Of course, each of us may have very wildly differing ideas on where the balance lies and what constitutes good and bad speech. Besides, who would take the role of this ultimate censor in any case? What person or entity can we trust not to abuse this incredible power to control the will of the people? The essence of blasphemy law is essentially that of restricting distasteful speech, specifically speech distasteful to adherents of religion. In order to truly counteract blasphemy, we must also address this idea. And on this, even in countries with no legal punishment for blasphemy, we fall short. The idea of freedom of expression, not just in matter but in manner, is one we must watch over with vigilance, for there are always a new breed of authoritarians who wish to erode it. While in the West we have respect for freedom of speech and do not have functioning active blasphemy laws, we do know that there is one religion we cannot criticize, cannot ridicule, or satirize. The most astonishing aspect of the months following the murders of the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists was the controversy surrounding the content of publication. While many asserted that, of course, violence is never the answer, freedom of speech is important, that nevertheless there were certain rules of decorum that any responsible media outlet should follow. Tony Barber at the Financial Times stated that Charlie Hebdo has a long record of mocking, baiting, and needling French Muslims. Too often editorial foolishness has prevailed at Charlie Hebdo. Quote, "This is not in the slightest to condone the murderers who must be caught and punished, or to suggest that freedom of expression should not extend to satire. It is merely to say that some common sense would be useful at publications such as Charlie Hebdo and Denmark's Jyllands-Posten, which purport to strike a blow for freedom when they provoke Muslims, but are actually just being stupid. It is difficult not to read that as, of course they're allowed to draw what they wish, but even so, they had it coming." Many writers, commentators, media personalities weighed in on the appropriateness of the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. This should be astonishing to us all. In the wake of gruesome murders, we insult the memory of the dead by passing judgment on what should be totally irrelevant to this conversation, the content of their speech. By doing so, it was nothing short of legitimizing the violence of the murderers. The French-Iranian author of Persepolis, Marjane Satrapi, said to the New York Times that she was worried about the rise of anti-Muslim sentiment, but that questioning the scathing satire of Charlie Hebdo was the wrong conversation to be having in the wake of the killings. People have the right to have a different point of view, she said, and to provoke. If you allow acts like this to create a climate of fear, we will have lost our freedoms. Salman Rushdie also noted that people seem to have learned the wrong lesson from the murders. What no one talks about is the fear. If people weren't being killed right now, if bombs and Kalashnikovs weren't speaking today, the debate would be very different. Fear is being disguised as respect. Freedom of speech is inextricably linked to freedom of religion. And as Fleming Rose pointed out in his book, the Islamists are in agreement as well. He recalled the Saudi cleric and TV preacher Muhammad al-Munajid on Al Jazeera saying, the problem is that they want to open a debate on whether Islam is true or not, and on whether Judaism and Christianity are false or not. In other words, they all want to open up everything for debate. That's it. It begins with freedom of thought, it continues with freedom of speech, and it ends with freedom of belief. Those that exercise their freedom to criticize, to blaspheme against Islam today, are therefore facing, if not the threat of an actual law forbidding the practice, but a reality in which the threat of violence from fellow citizens is omnipresent. And, to add insult to injury, a perverse social atmosphere in which the violence will be deemed understandable, and yourself branded as a hate monger. It is no surprise then that even here we practice self-censure due to real fear. We must remember that in many countries with functioning blasphemy laws, often the state does not have to step in to enforce the code. The people will do the work for them. In Pakistan, there is an informal moratorium on executions, yet those accused of blasphemy have been attacked and lynched. A mentally ill individual accused of blasphemy was killed while in police custody by a devout guard. Those who are lucky enough to avoid violent reprisals are often robbed of their ability to earn their livelihood, or put into mental asylums, or forced into hiding or exile. It is our duty to protect civil society, and we will lose that civil society the second we lose the ability to mock, to ridicule, and to satirize ideas we find repulsive and immoral. We would not have had the progress we have without this ability. For nearly every right taken for granted today was once horribly offensive to someone else. If we lose this ability now, we forsake the promise of any future progress. In order to champion the end of blasphemy laws worldwide, we must set an example of tolerance of free expression within our own countries as well, especially that which we find distasteful or disturbing. I'd like to conclude with a selection from Robert Ingersoll's defense during the trial of C.B. Reynolds for blasphemy. How has the church in every age, when an authority, defended itself? Always by a statute against blasphemy, against argument, against free speech. There never was such a statute that did not stain the book that it was in, and that did not certify to the savagery of the men who passed it. Never. By making a statute and by defining blasphemy, the church sought to prevent discussion, sought to prevent argument, sought to prevent a man giving his honest opinion. Certainly a tenet, a dogma, a doctrine is safe when hedged about by a statute that prevents your speaking against it. In the silence of slavery it exists. It lives because lips are locked. It lives because men are slaves. Thank you.